We're going to do a behind-the-scenes recording of the Crushing Debt podcast with Carmen Dellutri, who's a bankruptcy attorney here in the area with offices all over, including a soon-to-be office here in Tampa. We're going to be talking about bankruptcy law. We're going to be talking about creditors, although you'll hear Carmen's take on the creditors, which I think you'll enjoy. And so with that, if you're ready, let's go. So I'm going to pause for a couple seconds, do the intro, pause for a couple seconds, then we'll launch in. And I want to turn that down because I can hear myself too clearly. On this week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast, attorney Carmen Dellutri. So welcome back to this week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast. My name is Shawn Yesner, and as always, Crushing Debt podcast is brought to you by my firm, Yesner Law, although this week, like you heard in the introduction, this week's episode is also brought to you by the Dellutri Law Firm because my guest with me today, Carmen Dellutri, is a board-certified bankruptcy attorney. So welcome, and thank you for being on the show, Carmen.
Well, thank you for having me, Shawn. I appreciate you allowing me to do this with you.
Yeah, always. I'm always looking for good content for my listeners, for my audience, and I'm not really one that ever believes, although we're both in bankruptcy court, I don't really ever believe in competition. So we can, we may be competing for the same clients, but at the end of the day, we're all helping out the same people.
I agree 100%.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about bankruptcy law because you and I both practice in bankruptcy law, and it's one of the main ways that I'm able to help my clients and you're able to help your clients get rid of some debts. But what I wanted to talk to you about, what I know you really enjoy doing, is there are certain areas within the bankruptcy law where the creditors are going to make a misstep and they're going to get overly aggressive, or they're going to be incorrect in their analysis, or they're going to do something wrong in terms of how they collect the debt. And that's when you're going to pounce on them.
I like the way you said that, but I think of it a different way.
Okay.
Think of it this way. Before a person files bankruptcy, they're basically subject to a lot of contracts, whether they be credit card contracts, furniture contracts, a mortgage, and a car loan. And the creditors hold all the cards. And they can use the laws in the state of Florida to collect their debts and any legal means possible. I say legal means possible to try to collect those debts. When when you file bankruptcy, it kind of reverses the roles. And now the consumer protection statutes are in place to protect consumers. And there's one more thing. It's called a federal court discharge order. That discharge order relieves the obligation of the consumer to pay those debts. It doesn't erase the debt, but it relieves the obligation, which means nobody can ever try to collect it again. I take federal court orders pretty seriously, and I know you do too.
Yeah.
Some people, creditors, decide we're not going to take these things seriously and we're going to go out and try to collect these debts anyhow. And that's where I get a little mad.
Now, why would they do that? Is it because I would assume it's not the original creditor that knows they got discharged in bankruptcy? My assumption is the creditor then sells it to some other creditor. That creditor doesn't do their research. That creditor then comes after the borrower, at which point you or I get involved and go, hey, you're wrong because that debt was discharged and you should have gotten that information from your previous debt owner. Or are you seeing more situations where it's the company that was discharged in bankruptcy that's just not keeping accurate records?
We're seeing both. And
Okay.
I'm glad you brought it up that way because you're absolutely right. We see it both ways. We see the original creditor who just neglects to see or records it wrong or does something incredibly stupid and decides they're not going to follow that discharge order. Or we see it the other way around where a debt collector gets involved. They buy discharged debt. And there's a huge market out there for discharged debt. Now, as bankruptcy attorneys, we both look at it and say, who in the world would buy discharged debt? I mean, discharged debt means you can't collect on it. It's worthless.
Right.
Yet there's billions and billions of dollars of discharged debt is sold every year in the United States. And the only reason I would buy discharged debt is because I want to collect on it.
Right. Unless maybe it's secured debt. So you got some kind of asset you can pursue.
That's a different subject. I was talking specifically about unsecured debt.
I have no idea why anyone would want to buy discharged unsecured debt. By its nature, it's uncollectible.
Because they buy it for such a small amount, let's say pennies for $10,000 worth of debt. If one person pays, they're making money.
They're making money. And one person who doesn't know to call somebody to say, hey, this was in my bankruptcy, why are they going after it?
Absolutely correct. And that one person, I hate to say it, they prey on women and they prey on minorities.
Right. They being the creditors.
Because they know guys like you and me would just stick our head in the sand and say, go pound salt.
Right.
We're not going to pay them. But
Right.
women worry about this stuff, and they want to pay their creditors. It may be something small. It may be an old doctor bill for like $75. So they're just going to pay the debt.
Wow.
And I educate my clients saying, you don't pay anybody anything without you telling me. We send one shot across the bow, leave my client alone. And if they don't, we sue them.
Sue them under, and I know the answer, but this is your interview. So sue them under what theories?
Well, we have a choice. We can either sue them under the FDCPA, which is the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act.
That's the federal law.
The federal version of it. We have a Florida state statute called the FCCPA, the Florida Consumer Collection Practices Act. Or we go back to bankruptcy court and we get them for a discharge violation, depending on how egregious the violation is, because there's different remedies available in each whichever way you decide to go.
Well, and that's a question that I actually do have that I don't quite know the answer to is, do you prefer, because it's all the same violation. So if the creditor violates a bankruptcy discharge, it's a bankruptcy issue, it's a federal FDCPA issue, and it's a state law FCCPA issue. Do you have one preference over the other as to which court you choose to pursue the creditor?
That depends upon the judge.
Okay.
And I know that sounds crazy, but in certain courts, you're going to have more favorable judges for certain types of violations. So we sit down with our clients and we say, here's what we like to do. How do you feel about that? And they decide where they want us to go based upon what we recommend to them.
Okay. So you know the bankruptcy judge, because the bankruptcy judge is going, unless we've had a couple of retirements here recently, but you know the bankruptcy judge, but you don't necessarily know unless you're thinking the judges in Pinellas County may be more or less favorable than the judges in Manatee County, for example.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. So what other, how deep do you allow the creditor to dig their hole before you pull the trigger and you go after them?
It depends on what they're doing. Sometimes we string them along and let them do whatever they want to do. And we obviously the client knows, hey, the more phone calls, the worse it gets for them. And we've already told them to stop, and they're just going to keep digging their hole.
Right.
And in other cases, we pull the trigger right away, depending on how egregious the violation was.
So what's the worst one you've seen?
I can't tell you. It's still in litigation right now. But I've had some pretty horrible ones. And a perfect one was against the big bank.
Okay.
Gentleman filed bankruptcy, got his bankruptcy discharge, and they wound up suing him. And the gentleman had a heart attack when he got served with the papers.
Wow.
By the process server. Yeah, that was a pretty nasty one.
Yeah.
I had one collection agency tell my client that if you couldn't pay for this doctor bill, you should have laid out in the parking lot of the hospital and bled to death.
Wow.
So you see why I'm passionate about these things, because nobody should be treated that way. Nobody.
Well, by the same token, I've got one sort of brewing right now where the lady was literally laughed at when she called the creditor and said, I need some help. What are you doing? And they literally laughed at her. And so that one's brewing right now. We'll see where that one goes. So what are some, if I'm someone who owes money and I'm listening to this show, which I know I have a good portion of the listeners listen because I want to figure out, how do I eliminate my creditors? How do I get out of debt? How do I stop the phone calls? What are some things that I can do before I call you to set up my case better, to get you a case that has a good probability of being successful?
That's a great question. And there's a lot of different avenues where this can go. For example, if you at some point in time have the ability, or think you're going to have the ability to repay the debts, my advice always is ignore the creditors, because the more you ignore them, the further it gets down the pipeline, and then you'll get the next debt collector, and he may be willing to settle the debt because he bought it cheaper than the last guy.
Right.
And again, I know that sounds crazy to put your head in the sand, but if you're gonna ultimately want to pay these debts, or let's say, for example, you're just you're waiting for like 2 years, things are going to be better, then you want to wait a little while and put that time and distance, and all of a sudden when you make that offer to the creditor, they're more inclined to take it, because as you move further away from the debt, two things happened. You become more of a bankruptcy risk, and number two, the statute of limitations on the collection of the debt is ticking. So creditor who buys it down the line further and further away from the day you breach the contract, now has more of an issue, and they're going to be more inclined to want to settle with you.
Although it's a pretty long, it's what, a 4 or 5 year statute of limitations, though, isn't it?
5 year statute
5
of
years.
limitations.
So it's a pretty long time.
It is a long time, but it kind of goes kind of quick for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean, I got a call yesterday from a woman who hasn't been sued for foreclosure yet, and she's been in the house 9 years without paying.
Wow.
And she's like, she just wanted to come in and talk and say, what if this really happens in the future? What should I do?
Well, and sometimes it's because the bank just simply doesn't want the house back. The bank knows the house is in horrible condition, and they don't want to have to deal with it.
Exactly. That's another conversation for another day.
That's a totally different episode of the podcast.
Yeah,
exactly.
Totally different. But again, those situations happen on a regular basis, and we've got to have answers for these people.
Yeah. So if someone's interested in getting a hold of you, how do they do it?
Easiest way is go to our website. It's www.dellutrilawgroup.com.
And spell Dellutri just in case.
Dellutri.
Okay. And I know you've got a book.
Yes, I did. I wrote my book. I guess it's been about a year ago. I don't remember, to be honest with you, when we published it, but it's out there. It's called Are You the Next Success Story? Take Control of Your Finances. And really, it was written for people who need to get back in control of their financial lives. And it's a very simple book to read. It maybe take an hour or two to go through the whole book. But the reality is there's got a lot of good ideas in there just to show you that it's really simple. It's not as overwhelming as you might think to get back in control of everything. And
I assume the book would be available on your website, on Amazon, on all the normal channels.
It's on all the normal channels, but today on the website, or not on the website, we're going to say if you email my marketing director today, when you hear this podcast, her name's Casey Byrus. It's CBYRUS at DellutriLawGroup.com, and I believe it's on. It's in the comments of our Facebook Live. Will it be in his?
I can put it in the comments of when the podcast goes up, when the podcast finally gets released out on iTunes and internet and all that stuff. There'll be notes where people can click on, and I'll have a lot of those links in there as well.
And again, if you could put a link to Casey's email, somebody clicks on it, I'll gladly mail them the book. I'll pay for the postage and everything. I'll give them a book for free.
Nice.
That'd be my gift to you guys, my gift to Shawn and his listeners because of what they did for me by allowing me to be here today.
Well, cool. I appreciate you being on the show. I like to keep my episodes around 10 to 15 minutes long, and so we're pretty much right there. Although you are always welcome to come back. We can do more episodes. We can do future episodes. But I appreciate you being a guest on this episode of the podcast.
Yeah, great first date.
Yep. And we will talk to you in next week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast. Cool. And so we're done recording. My Facebook Live is still going. I don't know if your Facebook Live is still going.
Is it, Allison, or you stopped it?
Yeah, we just stopped it.
Okay.
So yeah, we did get a comment. Ooh, and Jeff Tebow is watching us right now.
Jeff Tebow, is that Tim's brother?
No, not Tim's brother.
My wife would be so happy I got Jeff Tebow on the line.
Yeah, no, not Tim's
Jeff,
brother.
how can we help you?
Jeff is a bankruptcy attorney like us.
Oh, good.
He's a buddy of mine who's also a bankruptcy attorney. So he's watching you on Facebook Live too. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Facebook Live. I'm going to sign off before we get more just goofy ass content on the Facebook Live site. But thank you. And the next time I have a guest in, we'll do Facebook Live again, and I will see you then.